Okay, I think that's us live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour. And we're here to discuss with our excellent panel the outcome of the local elections that we've just seen. As ever, can I just say, and particularly this time, put your questions on Slido and please vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel, because we've already got more questions on there than I'm going to be able to post. So if you can help me out, that would be great. Our panel today, John Curtice, who I'm not going to introduce because you all know him. Sophie Stowers, probably true of her too, if you're a regular, one of our researchers here at UK in a Changing Europe. Hannah Bunting from the University of Exeter, and Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. So here's your softball starter for 10, just to get us going. What have we learned from these local elections? Go on then, John, kick us off.
Short answer, not a great deal. In that basically the broad message of these local elections is to affirm the message of the opinion polls, which is that there has been relatively little change over the course of the last 12 months, and that the numerous commentaries that says that the Conservative parties are failing to narrow Labour's lead over them are, broadly speaking, correct. It is true that both the projection that we did and the one that Sky did in terms of, what would this mean in terms of the national vote share, was the same as last year. Whereas given the opinion polls, you might expect it to have been slightly bigger. However, the crucial thing you have to remember is that the reason why the Conservatives are now down as compared with 12 months ago is because they're now losing votes heavily to Reform. Reform were not on the ballot paper in 1 and 6 of the local council elections. But if you look at what was going on in those wards where there were local council, where Reform were standing, then you can see that the Conservatives are in pretty much as much trouble as the opinion polls suggest. The one thing that we kind of thought might be true, but didn't have as firm evidence on as we had in these, was the fact that the Labour Party is indeed struggling in areas with relatively large numbers for people who identify as Muslim. I mean, there were some pretty spectacular falls in the Labour support, and Gaza is clearly a problem for the Labour Party, at least amongst some sections of its support.
Wonderful. Sophie.
To reiterate John's last point there, really, at UK Change Europe, we're working on a report at the minute about ethnic and minority voters, and I think, looking at sort of Muslim voters in particular, that's a group that for a long time the Labour support has been very stable, a lot more than among sort of other ethnic minority voter groups. And so to see how, October 7th has actually really come into voters' minds across different areas of the country, particularly Muslim voters, and how that's affected voting patterns. And the vote over the weekend was sort of the last sort of real test of that, first real test we've seen of that, I should say. And so it was really interesting to see not just how that played out in terms of Labour's vote share, but actually where those voters were instead redirecting their support to, and how that varied across the country depending on, the options that those voters had available. I think that was a really interesting thing that we're definitely going to be looking into more as we look to publish that report in the next few months.
And also as we look towards a Labour government, I suspect. But anyway, Hannah.
Yeah, so I think for me, it shows yet again that voting patterns are complicated in Britain, especially now that people don't have that same attachment to political parties that they did have, sort of 10, 20, 30 plus years ago. We spoke about a realignment at the 2019 general election, but there was always a question mark of how stable that realignment was. And now we've got more evidence, I think, that the Conservative vote share is collapsing, that Conservative support is collapsing, but it's not necessarily directly going to one other party. We saw the others, independents, the Greens and Reform, where they stood, are all doing, better than we might expect if that support is going to go directly from Conservative to Labour. So it's that kind of voting pattern that I'm really interested in, and I think we've just got more evidence that it's complicated. It's not a simple story.
Wonderful. Tony, you have the unenviable task of saying something different now.
Okay, well, I will just add, I think the ongoing march of others and the growth of the Liberal Democrats again is worthy of noticing. I think the that point's just been made by Hannah, that the growth in the number of ratepayers and independents and others and various reform now in the others group does suggest that there is a sort of nibbling away at both the Conservative and Labour votes around the country over time at the local level, and that will eventually have its impact through at the national level. Second thing I'd say is that, and particularly in the steering of expectations before and after the results, mayors, these city, regional, combined authority mayors, are being seen as somehow totemically important in a way of trying to manage expectations before and then perceptions after the voting. And I think that was so visible in the way the Conservatives talked about the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchen and the not in the end West Midlands Mayor Andy Street. And then last but not least, just to end on a light note, I mean, it's always enjoyable after a round of local elections like this to look at the creative explanations used by government spokespeople for why they've done so badly. And I was, this time, I think it joined by a new one, really, which was, that we don't recognise the opinion polls, or words to that effect.
Thank you very much. I mean, the first thing I suppose to ask, well, I'm quite interested in, is turnout. Turnout seems to be quite low. It sort of ranged from, I think, the low 20s up to about the high 40s, if I'm not mistaken. What, if anything, should we read into that? Is that just normal? Is it a comment on the state of our politics? Is it a comment on the public's disinterest in local government? What should we make of the turnout in this round of elections? Any of you, but not necessarily all of you.
Well, actually, just from a personal point of view, I have the London turnout, but I don't know what the final national turnout was. So somebody else will know that, which will make it easier to gauge by it in historical standards.
Oh, John, you're muted.
Nobody will know the overall turnout for another 6
okay,
or
good.
9 months when Colin Bullings and Michael Thrasher have collected all the local council results. But in terms of the sample of results that we have, and Hannah may also have information on this, the turnout was pretty similar to last year, but it was about a couple of points down on 2022 and about 4 points down on 2021. What of course is also true is that the turnout in London was down, and I haven't had time to check this yet, Tony. You probably have.
I do. I've got the numbers for that. Yeah.
As to whether the gap between the turnout for the London mayor and the turnout for the last London borough elections has now narrowed a bit. Of course, beyond London, it's very difficult to tell what is the impact of the mayors, because in a lot of these places there was something else going on as well. The other thing I haven't had time to look at, but I've seen one or two which suggests it's probably true, is that places where there was only a PCC election, I suspect is also the case, we'll discover that the turnout is down. But the one thing that one can cast light on, which in a sense, I mean, clearly the willingness of people to vote more broadly is an important issue. But once again, as ever, a party that's doing badly on elections goes, oh, but the turnout was low. And then you go and do the analysis, you say, well, was there a relationship between the change in turnout since 2021 and the Conservative performance? And lo and behold, you discover there is no relationship. Now, it's aggregate data analysis, but shall we say, if it were true that was simply a case that Tory voters were staying at home, you might expect to find a bit of a relationship between how much turnout was down and the Conservative performance, and that relationship is absent. And to be honest, I mean, there are two things about local elections in particular, which are kind of the standard stock of excuses. One is it's a low turnout, and the other is of course, oh, but we're doing okay in the places that really matter to us. Those should always be regarded with a very, very high degree of suspicion.
We do have a London turnout, as you implied, John. The turnout for the London election or for the mayoral election was 40.5%, which was down 0.4% on the 40.9% in 2021. Now, it's been higher than that at 45% twice, and lower than it, down as low as 34%, 34.5% the first time the mayoral and assembly elections were fought. So, I mean, the turnout point is, again, in advance of the election was being heavily spun as a low turnout will be somehow good for the Conservatives, and no evidence from the London election in the event that either the turnout was low or that it was good for them.
Sophie or Hannah, you want to come in on the turnout issue? You don't have to.
No, I think I think it's already been summarised.
Okay. Cool. Now, I mean, one of the crucial things we hear every single time we have local elections is, you know, the results are judged against the baseline of what happened last time. I mean, that, and just out of interest, I was wondering, how do these results compare, not to last time, 2021, but to the time before when these seats were contested? It seems to me there was a very specific set of circumstances around vaccine rollout in 2021 that meant that the Conservatives did remarkably well. But if we judge them against not those results, but the one before, do we get a different sort of perspective on this? John looks like he doesn't like this question.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I mean, I could look it up for you, but I'm not going to do it in the middle of this webinar. I think perhaps the more interesting thing, and this is what I would focus on, is what we can do with local council elections is to compare what happened this year with last year. And the point about local council elections is you're not necessarily need to simply focus on the cycle of when local elections happen, right? I mean, but actually, I will be able to tell you one thing, but we'll come back to it, because of course for the local council elections, the last set of elections is actually 2016, just before the EU referendums. I'll come back to the point. So first of all, so far as comparison with last year is concerned, basically, and both BBC and Sky agree, Tories down a bit, Labour down a bit, Liberal Democrats down a bit more. But essentially, as I was saying at the beginning, really very, very little net change. What is true is that once you start doing projection for others, Hannah will tell you what theirs was, but I know it was up. We had 24. Now, that is almost the same as the 25% in the spring of 2019, which, and again, to emphasize Tony's point, I mean, that, of course, was a time when in the national opinion polls, both Labour and the Tories were deeply in trouble. 3 weeks later, the Brexit Party came first in the European elections, the Liberal Democrats second. So, you know, and I think we are forgetting that in the national opinion polls, we're all fixated on the lead of Conservative over Labour, but that actually around 1 in 3 voters are regularly saying none of the above, thanks very much. Now, it's partly Liberal Democrats, but they're not doing that well in the national opinion polls. But it is the Greens who've been running more strongly in national opinion polls at any point in any previous parliament. It is now also Reform. So we are looking at, we're looking potentially at a 5-party election, albeit one that may well be dominated one party. To go back to 2016, because one of the fascinating things about 2016, which perhaps is illuminating, is that it is the last election before the EU referendum. Now, been quite a lot of talk, and it is not incorrect to say that if you compare their position now with 2021, then the Labour Party has gained most in more Levy areas, and the Tories have lost ground least in more remaining areas, and that therefore the geography of party support that was bequeathed by Brexit has been reversed. But if you go back and compare with 2016, which you can do for quite a lot of these local councils where the wards haven't changed, what you discover that is compared with 2016, it is still the case that the Conservatives are, relatively speaking, stronger in Leave voting areas, albeit they are now down quite heavily, even in those areas. But that their relative position amongst Leave voting areas as compared with Remain voting areas is still stronger than it was back in 2016, and the opposite is true for Labour. In other words, the electoral geography of Brexit has partly been reversed, though for the most part that basically occurred between 2021 and 2023. There isn't much in the movement from 2023 to 2024, but it is only partially reversed, and so we shouldn't be running away from this. Oh, Brexit has disappeared in terms of the structure of even in local government. It's the way in which people are voting.
I managed to dig out. Sorry.
Go on, Anna.
Yeah, just very quickly on that point. Yeah, I think we hear a lot when parties win new sort of pockets of support where they say, "Oh, thank you for lending us your vote." And I think we're starting to see that it might well have been a lending of that vote in those kind of leave areas for some of them, because they're now, they're now sort of reverting back to other parties, or they're trying out some of their other options. And I think some of that biggest fall that they've had this time is because of the amount of success that they had when we're comparing it to, so it's easier to fall further when you've done better in an area beforehand. Yeah.
Go on, Tony.
Well, I was going to say the national equivalent vote share in 2016 was virtually the same, 32 Conservative, 33 Labour. So they were very close there. And then by 2021, as we know, the Conservatives were well ahead, and now Labour is well ahead. So that's all of that.
I mean, that's where the opinion polls were in.
Yeah.
At that stage, right? The parties were not that far apart. Absolutely.
I mean, but to Hannah's point about and John's point about Leave voters and Remain voters, Leave voters in particular. I mean, it's intriguing, as they moved away from the Conservative Party, they got a lot of attention from Conservative government, and as they move back to the Labour Party, they'll get a lot of attention. So, interesting demonstration of how, as a group, by moving your vote, making areas less difficult, less easy for one party to win, you will get political attention. And money.
Yeah, best thing you can do is be marginal.
Yep.
Now, I mean, we've talked about national equivalent vote and projected national share. So, Hannah, I have to ask you this. There's been a bit of a kerfuffle over the weekend over the Sky News projection, which, a lot of talk about we're heading for a hung parliament and so on. Can you just talk us through what the projection was, what it meant, what, if anything, you make of the reaction?
Yeah, so the projection was Conservatives on 242 seats, Labour on 294, Liberal Democrats on 38, and then others on 66. So obviously there was no voting in Scotland this time. So what we did was just leave Scotland alone and assume that, what happened in 2019 would happen again, because you can't speculate. We don't have any evidence or any data on what might happen there. There was a wait until we had 2 million votes in. We'd counted or, analysed 2 million votes before that projection was put together. And it's based on a national swing, plus I was also looking at a set of 23 constituencies where all of the wards in those constituencies had voted this time. So we were looking at it from lots of different angles. Now, it had the Conservatives down 130 seats and Labour up 93 seats. So in any normal election cycle, maybe some people would disagree with me, but being up 93 seats would probably be considered quite a big victory, and would be enough for you to, be the largest party at least and form a government and all of those things. And everybody would be probably celebrating that if any party, had managed to achieve plus 93. But because it wasn't a normal electoral cycle, and because they were so far behind last time, that even with these really big gains, that's why the projection was at largest party, but not an overall majority.
Okay, but this isn't a prediction of a general election, is it?
No, exactly. It's based on the data that we had from those votes of what happened this time. If it was, if exactly the same thing happened at a general election, and this had been a general election, that's what that projection, sort of predicts.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, leaving Scotland to one side for the moment. In fact, we'll probably leave Scotland to one side for the whole session, to be honest, and come back to Scotland later. I mean,
we are having a new First Minister in Scotland, by the way, Anand, and not unimportant.
No, I'm not saying nothing's happening in Scotland. I'm simply saying that for the purposes of this hour, we'll probably not talk about Scotland because there will be opportunities to do so in the weeks to come. But one obvious difference that people are flagging between these outcomes and the outcomes in a general election is the level of support for smaller parties, for the Greens particularly, and also to a degree for Reform UK. But that's probably the case, isn't it? I mean, the Greens aren't going to see this sort of performance in a general election, are they?
That would be unlikely, but we don't know that for certain, and we don't know necessarily how big that gap is actually going to be between how they are performing in local government at the moment and how they would perform in a general election contest. So yes, we wouldn't necessarily expect the level of, you know, the NEV, the national equivalent vote, had others on 23 points. So we probably wouldn't see that at a general election. But, yeah, it does tell us that other party support is up. And there are a lot of areas where Labour were actually down in their vote share in these elections. So if some of that is moving to smaller parties or independents, and if that, you know, is likely, or if they're able to sort of bridge or make that relationship and make it a little bit more stable, then it's, yeah, it sort of goes back to my original point of this election really just shows us that party support is complicated, and you can't necessarily make a really clear sort of story out of what's happening in British politics just yet. And I think that there is more nuance in it, and yeah, I think that's a really valid point and a really good conversation to have.
I mean, one interesting point on this is that in the London Assembly election result, the Greens held their vote almost exactly as a share compared with last time. But in the mayoral vote, it dropped by 2 percentage points, and that suggests a significant tactical vote by Green voters for Sadiq Khan and against Susan Hall, because at the Assembly level, the vote was almost unchanged.
Yeah, one thing we should also point out from the London Assembly result is that in terms of vote share, it's the worst Conservative performance yet. Again, it's another one of the many pieces of evidence that you can just look at real facts in real ballot boxes, and you can see how low the Conservative Party has sunk.
Okay,
absolutely agree with that. Yep.
Just as a point of information, if you're interested in the difference between projected national share and national equivalent vote, Steve Fisher's blog, Steve Fisher of the University of Oxford, has got an explanation of that for you, but we're not going to go into it now. So if you're hanging around for that, I'm very sorry to disappoint you. Sophie, how worried should Labour be about what we've seen in terms of a trend amongst Muslim voters in these local elections? Is this a cause for concern for the general, or is it a cause for concern even when they're in power? You're muted.
Concern.
No, you're not. No, you're not. Sorry.
Oh, we're not. Okay, good. Thank you. I think, you know, it's something to be concerned about in part because it's quite an unusual shift amongst a group of voters that are typically quite loyal to the Labour Party. And I think for any party that is concerning. And I think it's also, you know, it's the first true test of a lot of concerns of Labour MPs about the impact that Keir Starmer's position on Gaza and the party's position overall might have on its support. It's the first real test of that. So I can understand why party figures like Pat McFadden have been very keen to go out on media and, you know, stress that they're taking it very seriously. In terms of for the upcoming election, I would say, you know, Labour's lead is so large, and to an extent, the vote of that group of voters, of Muslim voters, is so concentrated that, you know, realistically in a general election, it's not going to have a huge impact on a huge number of seats. I'm sure you'll see shift depending on the options that are available to voters in those seats. But, you know, I don't think it'll be sizable. I think where the real concern for Labour after this set of elections is in the rising support for parties like the Green Party in cosmopolitan areas, you know, areas like Bristol across the country. Realistically, that's probably not a threat for the upcoming general election because, again, you know, the lead is so large, particularly in areas like, you know, Bristol. You know, they've still got a pretty sizable lead there, but I think they could be in a very similar position to what UKIP were for the Conservative Party while they were in government, sort of 2015 era. You know, they're a consistent challenger, so obviously from the left instead of the right, which are pulling discontented voters away. And in seats that might not be marginal this time around, but very well could be after, you know, Labour have had to been put to the test for 4 or 5 years in government, could be really important and a real significant challenger, I think, in those seats that are more marginal at the next election, even if not this time around.
So we should watch the Greens going forward, even if they're not a massive problem for Labour in the general election. Thereafter, there'll be something worth watching. Anyone else want to come in on?
Well, there's a very clear relationship between the increase in Green support and how well Labour do. Indeed, it was in some wards where there wasn't a independent standing on a Gaza position, then it was actually the Greens who were picking up. So yeah, no, I mean, there is no doubt, as both parties are debating about whether or not they should go to the centre or whether they should or not. Certainly, the Conservative Party needs to be aware that the Reform Party, where they did well, depressed their performance, and equally Labour need to be aware that where Green did well, then they were the party that was particularly losing out. Together to some degree with the Democrats, the Tories, it made no difference at all. And of course, there's a slightly bigger story behind this because, of course, in a sense, what's happened over Gaza is the first real challenge to the narrative that Sir Keir Starmer has been trying to portray about having changed the Labour Party. Now, what I mean by that, of course, is that as almost became part of the totemic feature of that was his emphasis on rooting out anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. Now, we obviously should be very careful about conflating anti-Semitism with the position in Gaza, but you can see how somebody who, shall we say, has particularly articulated the concerns, sometimes often legitimate concerns, of the Jewish community living inside the UK, has now found, in the very difficult circumstances of the Middle East, that actually, and it's those who are on the other side of what unfortunately is an argument, who are now, given these circumstances, who are now also at risk of leaving the Labour Party. So, it's the first real time when one can say, well, actually, it may not be entirely clear that the way in which Sir Keir Starmer has tried to change his Labour Party has proved to be an unalloyed success.
I don't want to keep saying and in London, but I'm going to say, but in London, I'd say this.
It wasn't, yeah.
And the matter of the two of the biggest swings from the Conservatives to Labour took place in City and East and North East, which are very large constituencies, a very large Muslim population. And Labour did quite well in Barnet and Camden, which has a large Jewish population. So I'm not praying London exceptionalism, but there will be certainly analysis to be done about whether Sadiq Khan was able somehow to appeal both to Muslim voters and to Jewish voters in London, or certainly not. There's certainly no evidence in London that either the Muslim vote or the Jewish vote from these figures was particularly put off by Labour. That's all I'd say.
Yeah, I would entirely agree with you, and it may well be that Sadiq Khan is the answer. Though we also need to bear in mind that the swing against the Conservatives in London is markedly lower than it was in the PCC elections, in the other mayoral elections, and it was across the in local councils. And of course, because the count is into much bigger areas, where the reason why you can pick it up with the wards is because we have some wards with majority Muslim populations. You've got a lot of variance, so therefore you can pick it up. And in London, it's going to be more difficult to pick it up.
I mean, I agree. I'm totally. I mean, the other thing about the London Labour votes maxed out. It's not going to go much higher in total. Sure. So now it's just, I mean, if you looked at the last, well, you of all people, all of you look at the general elections more than me. Many of the biggest majorities in the country in the last election were Labour majorities in London. Much good did it do them. So it looks as if some of that is now sort of unraveling a bit.
Yeah, and that does fit with a wider pattern because basically, and this is absolutely crucial. It helps to explain why the Tories lost so many seats. And it's potentially disastrous for them in the general election. Basically, the more Tory an area was in 2021, the more heavily its vote fell. And of course, London, for the most part, is not that Tory.
Anna, did you come in?
Yeah. I think it speaks to a wider point about minority ethnic voting patterns in general. I mean, in Brexit Land, the book by Maria Soboleska and Rob Ford, they sort of looked at some of that. And yeah, the analysis that I did of those 23 constituencies this time, there's not very many cases, obviously, but there did seem to be a relationship between sort of ethnic diversity and racial diversity and the Labour vote overall. So it's not necessarily just about Muslim populations, and I'm not sure that we know the full story around that yet. So it might be, again, more complicated. Apparently that's my broader point for today.
Sure. I mean, I think we know from the polling evidence that there's many a Labour supporter well beyond the Muslim community who is concerned about the stance the Labour Party have taken on Gaza.
Oh,
So we
and
know now that Hannah will
glad-
say it's complicated and Tony will say London is different. So
I'm going to
it's-
say London is different again, but only to strengthen Hannah's point, really, and John's point, that there was only one swing from Labour to the Conservatives in the London constituencies for the mayor, and that was in Brent and Harrow. And actually, the Conservatives did well in Brent and Harrow in the last borough elections, and these are areas with a substantial Hindu and Sikh, particularly Hindu vote. So there are other factors at play which need more research.
Yeah, I have to say we did look at the relationship between the Hindu population and party performance outside of London and didn't turn anything up. So
You
I'm
wanna
not,
do a teaser,
it
Sophie?
may be Rishi Sunak's religious background has a particular London attraction to it.
I thought, though, Hindu voters, as analysed in sundry post-general election work since, well, in the last 2 or 3 elections, has suggested that Hindu and Sikh voters are becoming more plural politically and moving away from Labour over time, or becoming more like the population as a whole over time, are they not?
Yeah,
Sophie?
sure. It's very difficult to pick this up from aggregate data, but insofar as you can, there's nothing immediately, obviously.
But the BES shows that, I think, over time. I think
Right.
Anthony Heath's done work on this.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Sophie, would you like? We've just done a big survey on this, so I'm going to let Sophie tease it. It comes out in June sometime, I think. But you're muted now. I know you're not. You've just got no lag. Sorry.
Sorry. I think it's one of those things where we've not necessarily seen it borne out in voting intention just yet. But when you ask people about, their warmth toward parties in particular and their views on things like economic and social issues, British Indians and particularly Hindus are the group that are sort of most rapidly shifting towards the Conservative Party of any ethnic minority group. You can see that quite significantly in the survey that we've just done. And really, that's not necessarily anything to do with either position of the two parties shifting, although the Conservatives having, a Prime Minister of Indian origin and also increasing net migration from India to a significant extent, certainly hasn't harmed their popularity with British Indians. It's actually, this is a group of voters that is actually starting to vote more in line with its economic and social preferences than it has in the past. It's nothing really to do with the parties themselves, but just a group of voters that is beginning to vote really as it always should have to a certain extent.
But actually, and this is the last thing, because I could go on about this for the next hour and a half, which isn't the point of this session, but is it not the case that we're finding that Indians buck the national trend in the sense that those with a degree are more likely to lean conservative now, which is the opposite of the population as a whole?
What we see that across ethnic minority voters as a whole actually is that we see the flip of sort of the pattern that's begun to emerge across the wider population, in that generally the more sort of high level of education you get, the more liberal you tend to become in your voting patterns explicitly. We see the reverse of that now amongst ethnic minority populations, and that particularly those with a degree or above are more likely to vote Conservative than their other ethnic minority peers. And that is particularly concentrated amongst British Indians as a group, but it's not just them. We see that quite broadly across that population.
I think what you're telling us,
our survey.
I think what you're telling us, Sophie, that when the white population has given up on the relationship between social class and voting behaviour, the BAME population now is beginning to discover it.
Yeah, definitely.
Politics is always endlessly fascinating.
We love it.
So look out for our report at the end of June. It's a big one as well, so put aside quite a lot of time to read it, because it will take some reading. Right, I'm going to go through a few questions that we've got in on Slido. You can tell they're not mine because they actually make sense and they're short. First one is, have the results of these general elections made you think again in terms of when the next general election will be? And when do you think the next general election will be?
No, 14th of November.
Okay. Sophie?
I've been telling everyone July, but I think I'm going to take that back now and pretend that I never actually told anyone that there's going to be an election in July. So, yeah, but I have no clue when it might be instead.
Anna?
No, it's not really changed my opinion. I thought it would either be October or December, and I'm hoping October, so that it doesn't ruin my Christmas, basically, by working all through.
Okay, Tony?
Well, I agree. Good King Wenceslas will not look out on the Feast of Stephen, see people canvassing. I suspect I go with 14th. 14th of November, I think, is the by far the most obvious date to go for.
Yeah, and we should explain. The point is that the political parties have moved their conferences to earlier in the autumn. The party conferences have become important money spinners, and the parties won't want to give up on making money before an election. The Conservative conference closes with Rishi Sunak on the 2nd of October. We would anticipate that he will use his conference speech to say, "I'm going to go to the Queen tomorrow, to the King, sorry, tomorrow, and ask for a dissolution." I say he wants a dissolution. There will then need to be a bit of time for the parliamentary wash up, and basically you then you've got to give 25 days working days notice, and you basically get to the 14th of November.
Avoiding the American election by just over a week as well.
Yeah, but of course the American election will be in the middle of the campaign. That's pretty much now impossible to avoid.
Yeah,
but there is a pleasing symmetry about the 12th of December, isn't there? Which
yes. There is indeed.
And that symmetry is starting to appeal to me sort of subconsciously now. But anyway. So
you're going to the 12th, are you, Anand?
Well, you see, I was 14th of November. I mean, in the office sweepstake, I have January.
Oh, no way. No way.
I've kind of given up on January now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Tony's quite right. The idea that you're going to dissolve Parliament on the 17th of December, which is what the last legal date is, and have people out, politicians campaigning over Christmas and New Year, forget it.
Can we stop our nativity play in order that we do some canvassing here?
Yeah.
Be popular.
It might be amongst parents. But okay. A question from Anonymous. How realistic are large-scale Lib Dem victories through blue wall seats? And I suppose all these questions, we're going to put them in terms of, on the basis of the results we've seen, how have your expectations about Lib Dem performance changed, if at all?
Well, they haven't changed because basically the evidence is the same as last year. Well, if anything, of course, in terms of their overall vote share, the Liberal Democrats are actually down a bit on where they were 12 months ago, and I suspect they will be disappointed with that. That wasn't necessarily something that we were expecting, but the pattern of last year, whereby in wards where Labour start off second to the Conservatives, Labour do particularly well, and the Liberal Democrats rather less well, and in wards where the Conservatives were defending their seat against a second place Liberal Democrat, the Liberal Democrats do particularly well, and Labour do not. That pattern is there again. So it looks as though Labour voters have finally they've either sufficiently forgiven the Liberal Democrats for their involvement in the coalition between 2010 and 2015 to be willing to vote tactically, or they now hate the Tories so much that even though they're holding their noses when they vote Liberal Democrat, but either way, they now seem to be willing to do so. And, this is very much the pattern that we saw in local elections back in 1995 and 1996. And, the 1997 general election was marked by high levels of anti-conservative tactical voting. Now, the honest truth is Liberal Democrats are betting the farm on this happening because they've done very, very little, making very little effort to try to increase their national vote share. So essentially what they're doing is they're saying, well, in these ward places where we're second, we're hoping the Tory vote's going to crash and burn, which it could well do so. And then by simply more or less hanging on to what we got in 2019, but then getting a little bit more by tactical voting, we will be able to overtake the Tories. I mean, it's an incredibly concentrated strategy. And some of us think that basically in doing that, well, A, by failing to try to push their national vote share up, they will probably in the end discover their strategy doesn't pay off quite as much as they might imagine. And B, even if that doesn't prove to be a problem, they run the risk after the election with a rather large parliamentary party, which is based on a very, very thin national voting base. And the moment that the Tories recover, which they might well do so if the Labour Party hits trouble, they'll all discover that the parliamentary base they've created looks incredibly fragile.
Any other thoughts on the Lib Dems and their performance and potential performance in a general election, which apparently won't be in January? There goes my sweepstake.
I'm surprised. I mean, it's a risk of taking one result and not in, and others will have more of a view about this than mine. I always thought that the Dorset result, which was an all-out council with a big Conservative majority, now has a big Liberal Democrat majority, was an interesting test insofar as any local election is for the debate about the extent to which the Lib Dems could make a big surge in the wider southeast, southwest, and they did quite well there. I mean, it was
Yeah, though we have to remember in Dorset the seats were last contested in 2019, so it's very, very odd in terms of the baseline year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say that because I'm in Exeter, so in the seats surrounding here, the Liberal Democrats are already campaigning quite hard, especially still in Tiverton and Honiton, which they won, it being very responsive. So the MP is working hard to sort of retain that seat, and we've got new seats. It's called Southwest Devon or Devon Southwest, I think, depending on how you write it in the. Which causes lots of problems for merging data together. So I wish people would think about that when they think of these constituency names. But yeah, they are in the Southwest. They really do see that as a key target, and they're already working on having those making those gains. So I think they are still definitely a credible challenger, especially here in the Southwest.
Anyone else? No. Okay, we've got the inevitable Brexit question, which I'm going to pose to you just because everyone wants me to ask it, which is, has Brexit become a vote-losing issue for the Tories? And if this is the case, could Labour get away with or benefit from being more pro-EU than they are currently being? Are they being a little bit too cautious?
Well, on the last point, I will refer you to the blog that appears on the UK and a Changing Europe website today. On the earlier point, what is true is that those people who have switched from Conservative to Labour are more likely than most Leave voters to have changed their minds about Brexit. And yeah, there's been something of a swing since 2016. We're now at about 58% rejoin, 42% stay out. So you can certainly argue there that there is some evidence. But however, still believing in Brexit isn't a sufficient reason for people to remain loyal to the Conservative Party. It just means that they're just more likely to switch to Reform to express their dislike of the Tories than they are to switch to Labour. But yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, the thing to realise about Brexit, I mean, Brexit, as I was arguing earlier, this is all true at the individual level. Brexit is still providing a lot of the structure of party support, albeit not as much as in 2019, i.e. the relationship between people's attitudes towards Brexit and which party they're voting for. But if you want to understand why the Conservative Party are where they are, it's nothing to do with Brexit. And basically, it's Boris Johnson and Partygate and Liz Truss and the fiscal event. In other words, the dynamics of party support since 2019 are not primarily to do with Brexit, but they're primarily to do with A, the fact that the Tories had a difficult hand, and B, the fact that they managed to make a pretty lousy job of playing it.
But Sophie, it is the case, isn't it, that a lot of Leave voters think the Tories they might not have changed their minds, but they think the Tories have handled us badly.
I think so. From the research that we did, it was probably about a year ago now, I think, June last year with Public First, about Leave voters and what they think of Brexit. I mean, a large number, even if they haven't changed their mind about how they would vote in another referendum, still disapprove of the government's record or still on the issue, or at least still place a lot of the blame at the government's door for it not turning out how they wanted it to turn out. So there is definitely sort of, dissatisfaction with the Conservatives' record on the issue of Brexit, but whether that's what's primarily causing, them to lose those votes, I think, I agree with John that that's not the issue. And I think you can see that, and that's not why Labour has won over so much of its support. Labour has won over a lot of its support primarily because it's not the Conservative Party as opposed to any policy, I think, that they primarily put forward. So you can see it's not, I don't think it's a function of, that as a particular issue.
And presumably, this is the question, because I don't know the answer. Presumably, the Labour Party is still targeting a group of Leave voters who are politically marginal and wouldn't want to trouble them by accidentally telling them the Labour Party now thought Brexit was a bad idea, if you see what I mean. Yeah,
but the trouble is, Tony, is that basically the wellspring of pro-EU support for the Labour Party is being constantly refilled, right? So the Leave voters that they are gaining are not necessarily Leave supporters anymore. That's not true of a majority of them, but they're disproportionately. But then the young voters the Labour Party has picked up since 2019, they are heavily pro-EU. One of the things that people don't talk about is, I mean, the other big movement since 2019 is voters from Liberal Democrats to Labour. Liberal Democrats have lost about 1 in 3 of the people who voted for them in 2019. They are virtually all pro-EU. And then actually the people who voted Labour in 2019 are now more pro-EU than they were, because they're moved in the same way as the general population. So what you end up discovering is that it's still the case that 75% of Labour's vote is a pro-EU vote. It's a little bit down on 2019, which is about when it was about 82%. But basically, despite the party's best endeavours, it still has a heavily pro-EU vote.
Yep.
And actually, ironically, Labour's vote, it's Labour's vote that's changed the least in terms of its Brexit composition. The Tories now, 1 in 3 Tory voters are favour of being inside the European Union, because basically the people who voted for the Tories in 2019, who were Remainers, they're just true blue Tories, so they've been very loyal. They've just lost a half of their Leave voters, so therefore what the Conservative Party has at the moment is no longer anything like the pro Brexit electorate they had in 2019, and the Democrat vote is now it's still predominantly pro-EU, but it's less pro-EU than it was in 2019.
Interesting. We've got a question from a certain Rob Ford, asking what problems will the rise of the Greens in local elections and local government pose for the next Labour government, assuming we get one? Nice and easy.
Well, I mean, you see I'm going to have to say in London again, aren't I? You see in London, particularly
you need to get
in
out
London.
more.
I know I do. No, that's why I've got balanced people in, Exeter and elsewhere. You can see from London boroughs where Labour is dominant that the Greens are becoming a threat to them. And so there's no question that in areas where Labour's dominant, there's no chance of the Conservatives or the Lib Dems doing anything anymore, then the Greens are beginning to nibble away at the Labour vote. Now, that's when Labour's relatively popular nationally. So if Labour were to get into government and then become very unpopular, the question of whether the Conservatives can then begin to rebuild themselves in local government, or whether the Greens begin to eat them, I think it depends which kind of place they are. I think where Labour's very dominant, it's easier for the Greens to do better. Where the Conservatives or very occasionally Lib Dems face Labour, I think it'll be harder for them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my flippant answer to the question is they won't cause as much trouble to a majority Labour government as the Greens are causing to the minority SNP administration north of the border.
Nice and safe. Sophie or Hannah, either of you on the Green? I mean, the Greens will be a challenge to Labour, won't they, in government, you'd expect, on the left?
Yeah, I think in terms of getting to the majority, then when you've not got as many councillors on the ground knocking doors and campaigning for you, but the Green Party do have those councillors, then that in itself brings a challenge when a general election campaign does happen. But yeah, I think having that probably for those people who the environment and climate change is their most important issue, having that voice represent those issues will make it more pressing probably for the Labour Party.
Yeah, I suppose the question.
I mean, much might also depend on whether or not Carla Denyer, the Green co-leader, can pick up Bristol Central and whether they can hang on to that Brighton seat. In other words, do they have a couple of MPs who therefore get called upon by the media to articulate their view, etc., etc. They've been very reliant on Caroline Lucas. And the question is, if they don't have a voice at Westminster, it will be more difficult for them to get their message across. But I think certainly what is true, I mean, you can see this in terms of the number of wars the Greens are fighting, is organisationally the Greens are just getting significantly stronger at the local level. But to exploit that, they do just also need that voice at Westminster.
Interestingly, that Sian Berry, who was elected on the list for the London Assembly on Saturday, has resigned today. So that means that she's been on the Assembly for 3 days and will now, she's running to replace Caroline Lucas for Brighton Pavilion. So obviously, well, all I've said, it's an interesting piece of manoeuvre. Can't see into other people's minds.
Actually, while we've got you, Tony, a slightly odd question here, which is, what do the local elections mean for local government? I mean, we've talked about, I mean, it's an election year, probably, sticking to my sweepstake bet. But, you know, these elections are about local government. And just looking at the results, are there issues we should look out for that might become sort of big and salient in local government because of the way these have fallen out? Things we should look for? It's
very, very hard. You know, all of us will have said when talking about local elections, of course, these are local elections, not a massive opinion poll, and then gone on to talk about them as if they were a massive opinion poll. Deep breath. I think, obviously, the fact local government's in the news, and there is some consideration then of the underlying challenges facing local government, and indeed devolution if there were to be a change of government, they do get discussed a bit more. So I think, though, you know, you can't not talk about them as if they were a grand national opinion poll. The truth is that issues like the financial plight of local government has had a bit of an airing, and the fact that, you know, it does make a difference if you vote Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat or another party, even these days, that gets a bit of an airing. So I think they matter, interestingly, because it does give local government an enormous amount of prominence for a few weeks. Yeah, and I suppose if we take Rob's question about the Greens and change it slightly and say, so Labour have got all these metro mayors now dotted around the country, and there's going to be an interesting dynamic between them and a potential Starmer government, isn't it? I mean, partly because of the promises Labour have made about their take back control bill. You've got the Brown report on devolution. So there's quite a lot promised there. But also, under a Labour government, it'll be Labour who are responsible for the local government funding settlement, which changes those. And it's not necessarily going to be a smooth and easy partnership, is it? Absolutely not, because many of the metro mayors, new and old, rely very heavily on central government for grants, for government money. They're not institutions that are free to do their own thing. And of course, the Tees Valley mayoralty, you know, a lot of money has been invested there. So it has held that. And it's hard not to see, if Labour were to take office, them being faced with, you know, all the other metro mayors, all of them, who 11, I think it is, who are Labour controlled, effectively wanting money for their tramways, their buses, their, you know, name what your sort of economic development tools. And we know the cupboard is bare. The cupboard is as bare if Labour's in power as if it is with the Conservatives in power. Anyone else on this sort of relationship between a Starmer government and these various metro mayors?
Well, the first thing, I mean, the one thing to say is that the first rule of politics, if you are in charge of a sub-state institution, is that it's locality first, party second. And that's the way you have to play it. That's the way that Boris Johnson played it. It's the way in which numerous Welsh First Ministers have played it. It was not the way the Labour Party played it in Scotland between 1999 and 2007. And I sometimes worry as to whether or not, if the Labour Party were ever to get back into power in Scotland in the Holyrood Parliament, that they might make the same mistake again. The Labour Party is still rather keen on talking about there being a nice relationship between sub-state institutions and the central government, when the truth is that what the public are looking for is somebody who's going to stand up for the interests of their area locally. And, you know, and in the end, again, insofar as it's clear that metro mayors can develop a personal vote, if they develop that personal vote, they would be wise to speak up for their area.
Just one worth making this point. It's, you know, the West Midlands mayoralty got a lot of coverage, and Andy Street did almost hold it against the odds. But it is clear from both his acceptable speech after he lost and Richard Parker, the winning Labour mayor, there was a piece of elegant traditional politics in the way they gave those speeches, which is a long way away from the rancor and bitterness that you normally hear, and they're well worth listening to in terms of traditional decent politics.
I always remember one phrase I heard. We did an event at Labour Party conference a few years ago, and we had a panel with Tracy Brabin on it on can Labour win back the Red Wall? And Tracy's opening line was, "We are in power in West Yorkshire," which struck me because that's how she saw the world. You know, we are governing this place. Actually, on one final thing that I'd forgotten to ask about, that I wanted to ask about, is can we draw any conclusions about voter ID and any impact it might have had from these elections, apart from conclusions about Boris Johnson?
Short answer, not as yet. And the problem is, of course, is that proponents and opponents can't agree on the evidence or what the evidence points to. And I suspect the debate will continue.
Anything from London, Tony? Got to ask you that.
Well, it was the first time voter ID had been tried in London. And you know, there's the fact that there's been no enormous media interest suddenly afterwards suggests it hasn't been a great big story. And you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg has opined about this since last year. You know, whatever the intentions were beyond improving the quality of elections, you know, it just looks as if young people are so used to, when they do vote, they're so used to having identification on them that it didn't have the age-based or ethnically based impact. Certainly not at scale that it once be, you know, when it was initially being discussed, when it was thought it would have, and it hasn't by all accounts. And the Electoral Commission research last year suggested that outside London there hadn't been a particularly large effect.
Yeah, the trouble is the opponents of the voter ID say, but hang on, it might only be 0.25% of the electorate who were turned away and didn't come back. But the trouble is that there are people that they will argue there are people who didn't get as far as the polling station in order to be turned away because they were advised outside, if you got your ID, oh no, I haven't. And that's the problem, is that
I get that, but
we can't agree on the evidence base, so the argument will continue irrespective of what happened.
But if there'd been a big fall in the London turnout, it would have been an easier, you know, I mean, of course we don't know what it would have been otherwise, but the turnout was virtually unchanged.
Sure. Hannah, were you going to come in then?
I was just going to add, I think the main evidence we have on voter ID is the extra strain that it puts on local councils and local electoral administrators. So I think they hopefully more councils got to sort of practice or get used to that, you know, that process, because ahead of a general election, that's when it's going to really put the most strain on those electoral administrators. Yeah, so that was all I was going to add.
Okay, and finally, I think it's got to be finally, we of course had a by-election this weekend that's got slightly drowned out. Are there different lessons we can draw from that by-election? There are things that by-election taught us that were different, separate from what we learned, perhaps about the role of and the support for reform, or are the conclusions basically in line with what we've learned from the locals anyway?
Yeah, another by-election, another record swing, third biggest drop in Conservative support in post-war by-election history, third biggest swing for Conservative Labour. But hey, guys, we're getting all used to this. This is the fifth by-election in a row in which you've had a swing over 20%. No previous parliament has seen so many. And it's a particular illustration of the impact of reform, because they got 17% and they almost overtook the Tories. But, you know, all that evidence is there in the local council elections as well. And basically, Blackpool South is all of a piece with all the other by-elections the Labour Party has picked up in the last 9 months or so. Sophie, anything on Blackpool South?
Just probably a little bit about reform, in that there was some work by Paula Surridge who touched upon how basically in the last kind of few electoral contests, based on voting history, based on demographics, that reform might have been sort of underperforming based on how we might expect them to. And so I think there was probably a bit of pressure for them to do quite well in Blackpool South, particularly because it's that type of seat that should in theory be really fertile ground for them to do well, and they have. And I think it's kind of really sort of put into perspective that, you know, polls aren't exaggerating how many people say they're going to vote for reform. They're actually probably pretty reflective. Obviously, people change their minds when they get to the voting booth, and it might, you know, lower in practice. But actually, reform does pose a particular threat for the Tories. And in seats like sort of Blackpool South, you know, heavily Leave voting seats, which were flipped in 2019, Labour is making a comeback, and reform still strong challenges. So the Tories are going to be getting sort of pincered from both sides in those kinds of seats. So yeah, it just kind of reaffirms the challenge, I think, that Reform are posing to them.
Yeah. The only good news for the Tories is that at least Reform is still not performing at the kind of level that UKIP did between 2012 and 2015.
Hannah, anything on this?
No, again, I think it just is more evidence that it's complicated, and there's something weird about this parliament where we have seen so many of those biggest swings. If you look at the table of top 10, I think, yeah, the majority of them have happened in this parliament. So we could see that happen, or that seismic sort of shift. We could also see that happen at a general election, but yeah, it's complicated.
You got that line in again. Well done.
Yeah.
Go on then, Tony. We've run out of time, so I defy you to make a London point about Blackpool South.
Well, it's an excellent place and wonderful to visit from London. I like the seaside, I do. I like the seaside.
Well, what better
British
note on which to end? Listen, we have run out of time. It is now 2:00, but John, Sophie, Hannah, Tony, thank you ever so much. I'm sure we'll see you all back again at future events. Just a quick plug, on the 15th, we have our next In Conversation, both in person and online, with Shadow International Development Secretary Lisa Nandy. Go to our website and sign up for that if you can. And we'll see you again for a UK and Changing Europe lunch hour very, very soon. Thank you all so much, and thank you for tuning in and watching.